From Iowa City, Iowa Public Radio presents Live from Prairie Lights, America's best writers reading from their poetry and prose from Prairie Lights Bookstore. Support for this program comes from Prairie Lights Bookstore, 15 South Dubuque Street, Iowa City. We are broadcasting over WSUI AM 910, WOI AM 640, and over the internet, wsui.uiowa.edu. Also, the Live from Prairie Lights programs are archived on our website. You can listen to them anytime, anywhere in the world. Iowa Citian and former City Council member and author Larry Baker reads from his latest novel, Athens, America. There will be time later for the members of the Prairie Lights bookstore audience to ask questions. You'll understand why I said that in a moment. There have been many authors on this program who have undoubtedly folded the intrigue and maneuvering of people and politics from their own towns into their fiction. So it's easy to relate to their books objectively because their towns are unknown. Larry Baker's Athens, America is going to be more subjective experience because Iowa City politics and some of the intensely felt public issues are in play in his story. The identities of most of the characters are thinly cloaked to protect some, but keep the rest of us guessing. In Athens, America, citizens of a small Iowa college town are caught up in the strife of local politicking and issues that surround public distrust of local law enforcement after two young people die in a terrible accident. In addition, shots are taken at the city's deer population. Does anything sound familiar? There is a local bookstore named the Prairie Schooner and an adjacent town called Coral Ridge. The story opens with a car chase between a police officer and a runaway drug dealer who loses control of his car and accidentally kills a young woman, a jogger. A public crisis ensues as the Athens Police Department is accused of negligence in the case. The lives of City Council member Joe Holly and Jack Hamilton, the jogger's father, thread through the book as each tries to cope with events that go terribly awry. Holly is burnt out on the job yet seeks re-election, but his often politically incorrect commentary roils public meetings. He's experienced his own personal loss. His baby daughter died years earlier, and Holly talks to her at her gravesite with his autistic son in tow. She's buried in a cemetery not far from a mysterious black angel and not far from the fresh grave of the Hamilton's daughter. Hamilton and his wife, a biracial couple, refuse to participate in the public drama that their daughter's death has inspired. The black angel and a huge mystical deer also come into play in Baker's story, in which he amends Tip O'Neill's famous axiom, all politics is local. For Holly, all local politics is personal. Peter Coyote, the actor and author, says, I read this extraordinary book in two enormous gulps while on the set in Vancouver. Athens has it all, like a multi-layered world carved on ivory by the most skilled of Chinese artisans. Larry Baker has replicated our complicated, contentious, duplicitous, stupid, and deeply moving America. You'll see your town in this powerful story, and how you see yourself after reading it may be determined by who you are in your own community. Larry Baker was raised an Army Air Force brat, so he lived all over the country and then overseas. He ran drive-in movie theaters in Texas and Oklahoma for many years. The hijinks he faced in that business served as the basis for his first book, Flamingo Rising, which was made into a TV movie. He earned the Ph.D. in English from the University of Iowa and served on the Iowa City Council for 2 terms. Help me welcome Larry Baker to Live from Prairie Lights.
Thank you, Julie, and thank all of y'all for coming. This is a little bit more than I expected, but I'm not going to turn it down. I appreciate all of you coming. And what I want to do tonight is read you the first 15 or so pages of the book. And I think Julie did a really good job of explaining the general plot. So let me explain the structure a little bit. The first scene is the death of 2 teenagers in a car chase gone bad. And from that scene, I shift into the morning of the same day, and you're introduced to the family of the girl that's killed in the car wreck. And what happens through about half the book is those particular sections lead up to her death. And you already know she's dead from the first chapter, but her family does not. And so you're following the progression of their day up until that moment. And then, after that morning scene is set, I go into the first-person narration of the major narrator, Joe Holly. So you open up with sort of an omniscient third person, you shift to a very limited third person, and then you go into first-person narration, and I think you'll see a change in tone. So let me do this and see if you have any questions after that. Athens, America. Begin with 3, a driver, a runner, and a cop. The cop is chasing the driver, and the runner is waiting for them at the corner of First and Court. The driver is young, a teenager, and you would not want him living near you. He sells drugs and steals without hesitation. He is often high, and he's more often angry than calm. He has dark black skin and dresses in code. And a few seconds before he dies, he's reaching for a gun on the seat next to him. The white cop is also young, a few years under 30, but he has been old all his life. Old in the sense of always having known what he wanted to be, even as a child. He was always the cop, never the robber. And there had never been any other cops in his family, and his parents were mystified as to why he had chosen this career. But they loved their son, and they were proud of him, especially when he graduated from the police academy. They were immensely relieved when he got his first job in their town, where he had grown up. He did not tell them, but that was part of his plan, too. When he was 30, he had told himself he would think about marriage, everything in order, everything under control. But his parents died in a plane crash, and his sense of control died with them. The runner is the youngest of the 3. She is black and white, and she's running toward her home when she sees the flashing red lights and hears the sirens. She stops to see what happens, and a few seconds later, as the driver's car rolls toward her, she steps to her right. It is the wrong direction. The cop and the driver have a history. On this warm evening, that history comes to an end. For months, the cop had been cruising the driver's neighborhood, and for months, the driver has taunted the cop. But the cop is not innocent. He has gone out of his way to look for the driver. He would drive slowly behind him, and he's given the driver 2 tickets for minor traffic violations, a rolling stop, failing to give a signal. But if you had asked the cop why this driver, he would not have had a satisfactory answer. The driver is an outsider from a bigger city to the east, and he brought the big city's problems into the cop's small hometown. It's not that simple, it's not that clear, but the cop is not able to get beyond his feeling that his role in his hometown is to protect it from the driver. The cop has worked 8 straight days filling in for other cops. He began his shift this morning going to a domestic disturbance in the driver's neighborhood. The husband there had been warned. The husband was pounding on the door when the cop arrived. The husband resisted arrest, and the cop had to call for backup. The husband took a swing at the cop and tried to get his gun, but the cop had him on the ground before things got out of control. And as the cop put the husband in his patrol car, the driver cruised by and almost raised his middle finger toward him, a small gesture. In the 7 hours before the chase, the cop has answered a dozen calls, backed up other cops, checked car tags, arrested a drunk downtown, had too much to drink at happy hour, and a half hour before seeing the driver again, he had broken up a knife fight between 2 other drunks in an alley downtown. His uniform shirt sleeve had been ripped. The dispatcher told him to call it a day, but the cop wants to swing through the driver's neighborhood one more time. He has begun the day already exhausted, but when he sees the driver run the stop sign, he has a profoundly satisfying surge of energy. It is supposed to be the same routine. The cop will stop the driver, and the driver will either smirk or sit sullenly while he's being lectured. But this warm evening, the driver does not stop. He keeps a steady speed, ignores the flashing lights, and then they reach First Avenue. The cop is talking to the dispatcher just as the driver begins accelerating, and the driver then has a minute to live. The cop will be gone from his hometown in 24 hours, and the runner is waiting at the corner. The cop thinks that he knows why the driver is racing away. This time, there is something in the car that the driver cannot be caught with. The driver will finally be sent away for a long time. 50 miles an hour in a 25 zone, then 60, through red lights and stop signs in a straight line, other cars swerving for self-preservation. The cop's window is open, and he feels the air swirl and roar inside of his patrol car. He starts to scream at the driver ahead of him, and his screams drown out the other voice in the car with him, a static, laced voice calmly telling him to break off the chase. But the cop knows where the driver is headed, through the next stop sign and out to the highway, where he has no jurisdiction beyond his control. The driver looks back, then looks forward to the next stop sign, but his brain is crossing wires, and two contradictory impulses collide. Get rid of the gun and turn the car. But he cannot do both, and he does not see the runner. The cop sees it all in slow motion. The driver's car lurches to the left at first in court, the rear starting to spin faster than the front, and then the driver's side of the car begins rising so that the cop sees the black underside. Like a movie stunt, the car rolls once and then slides on its roof to rest on the green slope beyond the curb. The cop sees it all, but he does not see the runner. He has 2 minutes alone. Other patrol cars are already coming. He is out of his car and over to the driver's car, but the driver is pulpy and red and no longer human. And then he sees another form further up the slope, almost like it was sleeping. It is at this moment that the cop sees his own life go away. He kneels beside the sleeping runner and touches her crooked neck. Where did she come from? The cop looks around for help, but he's still alone. He starts CPR, but he knows it's useless. The runner is dead. But who is she? The cop hears sirens, and he sits beside the sleeping runner, holding her hand. He knows that he has done something terribly wrong, and he will pay. He will go away from his hometown and never come back. And until the end of his life, he will keep two things to himself about this moment. As a small child, he had always dreamed about angels, and in those dreams, the angels had this girl's face. That was one thing, a feeling that might even be understandable if he ever chose to share it. But the other memory will never be shared. As he sits there on the slope with the sleeping girl, he looks up to see an enormous blood-red deer standing over him, looking down at him and the girl. And then I'm going to shift into the mourning of the family of the girl. Her father's name is Jack Hamilton. Jack Hamilton began every morning with a ritual. He was not paying homage to his wife's God. He was merely paying the daily tithe needed to redeem his body from a night of bad sleep. From his neck to his ankles, most of his joints reminded him how much he had abused his body as a young man. From junior high until his second year as a linebacker for the Chicago Bears, when his right knee could no longer be patched together, Hamilton had thrown himself at other muscular bodies and usually hurt them more. His teams might have lost, but Jack Hamilton never had a bad game. First, he simply sat on the edge of the bed, staring in the dark at the red glowing numbers on his clock, rolling his shoulders and neck, reaching down to touch his toes, which he could not do when standing. He got up at 5 o'clock every morning except Sunday. And after standing and stretching, arms out and upper torso slowly turning at a right angle to his legs, he would put on his cotton sweatpants and pullover, go into the kitchen, turn on the coffee maker, put his hands on the edge of the table, and slowly do deep knee bends. Not many, just enough to get limber. And after his coffee, he would go for a walk around the block. Even in the coldest of Iowa winters, Jack Hamilton walked around his block 3 times, a fast clip, but never running, too hard on his knees. And as he walked this late May morning, he reviewed plans for his day. Monday through Friday, those plans had to include his daughter Rebecca, getting her to and from school, taking her to flute lessons or to her volunteer work at Mercy Hospital or a dozen other spontaneous events of her teenage life. He called her Becca, B-E-C-K-A. He called her Becca because she could never pronounce her own name as a child, and it always sounded like Becca when she told someone else her name. And as soon as she entered high school, she began to insist that her parents call her Becky, not Becca, but Hamilton and his wife had not mastered the change. 3 laps around the block done, he went home to wake his wife, Marcy. He would sit on the edge of the bed next to her, lean down, and kiss her. Usually she would act like she was still asleep, and he would kiss her again, usually. But this particular morning came after an argument the night before. They seldom argued, so making up was not a natural act for either of them. The night before, the argument had been about money for their daughter. Marcy wanted to increase Becca's allowance, and Jack thought she was getting enough. The argument ended with him being exasperated because, as he told his wife, "You're going to give it to her anyway, no matter what I say, so why did you even bother asking me?" As he walked that morning, he knew he had been wrong the night before, but he resented being put in a situation that had made him look like the bad cop in a good cop, bad cop drama. It had happened before, and usually about money. Hamilton and his wife both worked. He was a clerk at the post office. She was a 5th grade teacher at Regina Elementary. Solid middle-class homeowners in Athens, Iowa, with health insurance and a retirement program at his job so that she could continue to work at the Catholic school even though the public schools paid more and had better benefits. With their 2 jobs, they lived a better life than their own parents had led. But Jack Hamilton could never shake the fear of being poor. He grew up in Chicago, raised by an unwed mother, sharing his bed with a younger brother in a room with 2 other brothers. A football scholarship got him out of Chicago to the University of Iowa, and 4 years later he had gone undrafted by the NFL, but he walked into the Bears training camp, stayed until his knees, as he told his older brothers, turned to crap. His wife woke up with a single kiss this morning and mumbled, "How was your walk?" reaching out to pat his hand. Hamilton knew she was trying to make up after last night's argument. She always took the first step. So he whispered back, "Still cold out there. Feels like we might just skip summer and fall and, go right to winter." The birth of his daughter was the second miracle in Jack Hamilton's life. The first was meeting Marcy Sturdivant. He was a college freshman on a football scholarship who could not read or write. Marcy was a senior, hired by the athletic department to tutor a dozen black athletes like Hamilton, and her instructions were simple: keep them eligible, whatever it took. If that meant that she did some of their assignments, so be it. She was a devout Catholic, but she compromised. She told her friends that the idea of a student athlete was a bad joke, especially for the football program. Eligibility was the goal, not education, not even graduation. But of all the tutors, her groups actually always had more athletes get a degree of some sort because she went beyond teaching them basic skills. She also arranged their schedules, mediated disputes with instructors, and made it possible for them to continue living their dream of going professional. College was simply a farm system for the NFL, and a few succeeded, most did not, but they always remembered Marcy Sturdivant. Jack Hamilton was different from the others. Marcy knew that after meeting him. At first, she thought he would be a lost cause. On paper, he was illiterate to the point of seeming retarded. He had a conditional admission, meaning that he was athletically good, but not good enough to be guaranteed a scholarship regardless of his high school transcript. But then she talked to him. He spoke clearly, was even articulate, and he was absolutely focused on his goals, and those goals went beyond a pro career. He practiced harder, went to class religiously, attended her study halls without fail, but for the first few weeks he made no progress in reading or writing, and no amount of revision seemed to help. Marcy then realized that Hamilton had more wrong with him than just a bad public school education. So she literally took his hand and walked him to the university testing center. And at the end of the day, they both listened to a mannish woman explain how he was suffering from a combination of learning disorders that had never been diagnosed before. He could overcome them, he was told, but it would not be easy, and he would have to work against those problems for the rest of his life. So when Marcy told her Iowa descended from German stock parents that she was marrying a 6'3" black man from Chicago, she could only repeat what she had told her friends earlier. Something happened that day in that office as he looked over at me, a look on his face like I was something precious he had lost and then found. He made me feel like I was holy. Hamilton's family was not upset that he married a white woman, but his brothers and friends were astonished in his particular choice. His oldest brother in particular teased him, "Man, is that the best you could do? Other brothers are backing pretty white women. Why you got to get the ugly one? And you know, you ain't the handsomest nigger in the field. You two have some babies. You're compounding ugliness. You're going to scare the nurses to death." Jack Hamilton was not handsome. Marcy Sturdivant was not pretty. Their daughter, Rebecca, was gorgeous. Even as a newborn, more and more as she got older. And the greatest pleasure of their married life was when they could introduce their daughter to someone who had never seen her before, and always the look of, "You're kidding me, right? That is your daughter?" And then the smile on that person's face, a smile that a confrontation with beauty always provoked. Turn the corner of any museum and see a classic work of art for the first time. You might be disappointed if you met the artist, perhaps a miserable human being, but the art gave you pleasure that you could not resist. You stop and marvel. And that was Rebecca Pearl Hamilton. As his wife showered, Hamilton read the morning paper. He usually started with the sports page, especially when the football season began, but this particular morning he went right to the lead story on the front page. The Athens City Council had a long meeting the night before. Another public hearing had disintegrated into a shouting match. What should be done about all the deer running wild in the city limits? Hamilton had seen them in his own backyard many times at night, so he and Marcy had decided to put up a fence to keep them out, and they were destroying most of the vegetation that she had cultivated for years. The council was considering a plan to hire someone to thin the herds by shooting them. Deer lovers on one side of the council chambers, aggrieved neighbors on the other side. The newspaper account made it seem like a circus. He walked to the bathroom door, coffee cup in hand, and talked to Marcy. "Another wild night at City Hall. Suppose we should start watching those meetings on TV?" Marcy talked over the streaming water. "You're the one with all the free time. You watch." Hamilton replied. Point taken. It was true. He did not have to bring his work home with him. Marcy was always working on papers or projects for her class. He said, "Maybe I'll run for office." He looked at his wife's outline through the steamed-over glass door. Sticking her head out from behind the door, she said, "Just make sure the divorce is final first, okay?" Hamilton laughed. It was an old joke between them. He would sometimes mention running for the city council, and Marcy would always tell him, "Get a divorce first because I don't want to be married to a fool." And he would always nod in agreement. "All right, a man's got to be crazy to want that job." And so the argument from the night before was fading. By 6:30, they had both showered and finished their coffee. It was time to wake their daughter. She had a second-floor bedroom, so her mother usually made the trip up. His legs did not like stairs. He would be cooking breakfast by the time Becca and her mother descended, and it was the best moment of the day for Hamilton to turn around and see his daughter and wife at the table. Becca was in a foul mood this morning. She was 15, beautiful, talented, and mad at her father. He asked, "How many eggs? How do you want your eggs this morning?" She snapped, "How do I want them every morning, Daddy? I don't want them. Eggs are bad for you." Oh, I forgot. He apologized insincerely. He knew she did not want eggs. He looked at Marcy, who mouthed silently back at him, "Why do you keep doing this?" Becca said, "Yeah, right. Becca, tell your father what. Becky, my name is Becky, please." It was the last part of the morning ritual, teasing his daughter until she finally laughed. Still, as he and his wife had to admit, and as other parents had told him, teenage girls were sometimes not a pleasant chore. This morning took longer, but Becca finally surrendered. And as she left with her mother for school, she shouted at her father, always her last words until seeing him that night, "See you later, Gator," and he would always respond, "Not if I see you first." Wife and daughter gone, Jack Hamilton cleaned up the kitchen, and with his house in order, he went to work. And now we're going to shift into a different point of view. Until the girl died, I always thought that life was a joke. Not always funny, mostly never, but certainly not something to be taken seriously. I mean, if you took it too seriously, you had to go crazy. Too many things that make no sense to someone like me, who always wanted to believe in God, but who kept getting proof to the contrary. My first baby dies in her sleep. My second, my boy, is born well, grows like a flower, but now seems mindless. My wife is slowly killing herself with grief and rage and booze right in front of my eyes. Wouldn't I have to be ironic? Wouldn't you? Where's the sense in all this? So it must be a joke, right? Then I get a call telling me that a 15-year-old black girl is dead, a girl from another world, and a week later I go to one of those lunatic council meetings and listen to a mob scream that I killed her, that my hand was on the wheel of the car that propelled young Becky Hamilton into the hands of a God that does not exist. I live in Athens, Iowa, a town that doesn't really exist either, except as a moral lesson in mass hysteria. North Carolina has Chapel Hill, the Athens of the South. Georgia has Athens, the Athens of Georgia. I have Athens, Iowa, the Athens of the Midwest. Athens, more pigs. Iowa, more pigs than people, corn capital of the universe, the heartland of America. Athens, like all college towns, an island of art and intellect and tax-supported affluence, a world safe from the crime and poverty and shameless hucksterism of the rest of America. Or so we tell ourselves. We're different, we're better. We live the life of the mind. Athens, a world of perpetual adolescence, a world in which half the population is engaged in preparing the other half for their future. Give us your young, we tell those nervous and loving mothers and fathers who want their children's lives to be happier and more comfortable than their own. Give us your sons and daughters, their hopes and fears, their insecurities, and their student loans. Wrap them in an ACT and SAT score and pack them off to Athens. I love this town. I really do. I fell in love with Julie here, buried my first child here, and had always assumed I would die here. I just wish I'd been able to save it from itself. Instead, here I am, turning all of us into a morality play, changing the names to protect the guilty as well as the innocent. Don't misunderstand me. This isn't a story about academics or academia, about classroom politics or angst-ridden professors chasing firm-flesh co-eds seeking the meaning of life as they realize that education guarantees neither intelligence nor happiness. Stories about college are a dime a dozen, full of sound and furious Francinian prose signifying nothing. I went to college in Athens. I met Julie in a classroom. She was my teacher even though I was older than her. But this is not about college. This is about trying to make sense out of tragedy. Trying not to take myself too seriously because, after all, life's a joke, right? This is a story with villains, but not enough heroes. Not even me, who should have been braver when I needed to be brave. Come down to it. This is just a story about my divinely precious son, Danny, and my wife, whose breathing I study every night as she sleeps. afraid she'll just will herself into stopping. A story about my town and my family and how I lost one. Thank you. Now, if we run out of questions or we have extra time, I have one more scene to read, a 4th of July celebration in the city park of Athens. It's called Weber Park. And it's literally right next to the town called Coral Ridge. And it's when the giant deer shows up, so we'll see. Julie?
Did you want to, okay, you're listening to Live from Prairie Lights with Larry Baker tonight, our author and our guest, and he's reading from his new book called Athens, America, published by First Coast Books, and he's offering time to the in-house audience, as we normally do at Prairie Lights Bookstore, to let them have a chance to ask him questions and comment on this book, and his other book is called Flamingo Rising as well. If you have questions or comments, let me know. This book is about the search for healing. Is that what...
It is about trying to make sense out of tragedy and how a town comes to terms with that tragedy. I have to remind people, this is made up. It's fiction. You'll see lots of stuff. I mean, the whole sort of material world of this book is very recognizable. Once you walk in downtown Athens, you're walking through a very familiar spot. I mean, one of the issues in the book is expanding Oakland Cemetery, where the Black Angel is, and you got all the deer run through town, and you've got all sorts of real. I mean, one of the reasons there's a lot of people here tonight is I think half the people in this room are in the book, and you know it, and you're going to, But I always have to keep telling people this is fiction, not fact. I mean, there's a lot of good stories about Iowa City, that nonfiction stories that somebody ought to write, but I'm not the person to do it. I'm not objective, and I'm not a good nonfiction writer. But it does need its own objective version. So one of the things I am not going to talk about, if somebody's read the book and say, well, is this character, is that somebody? No, it's not. Now, if you say, now is the Doug Russell in this book the Doug Russell in Iowa City? I'll say, of course it is. Absolutely. Is the Phil Reister in this book the same one in Iowa City? Absolutely. If your name's in the book, it's you. But here's the trick. If your name is in the book, it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
You're listening to Live from Prairie Lights with Larry Baker tonight, and his new book, Athens, America, and there's a question here.
Larry, when you were describing the young woman that was killed at the beginning and her personality, it made me think of your daughter. Just some of the things about, I mean, I'm sorry, but I just wonder how, as an author, if you choose something to happen to somebody that's of a certain age and a certain personality type, how do you separate yourself in the process from grieving over somebody that you love in your life?
Well, it's an interesting question because you're half right. One of the things that's obvious about the daughter in this book is that she has a lot of characteristics of my daughter. But the truth is, my daughter has a lot of characteristics of every 15-year-old teenage girl. That's universal. One of the things that, this is awkward to talk about, but when you're trying to understand grief of somebody else who has lost a child, the only way you can start to understand that is to imagine the loss of your own child. And yeah, that goes into this book. You always imagine the worst, and you try to channel it. Let me recommend a song to you. Early in the book, there are lyrics from a Harry Chapin song called Tangled Up Puppet. I had to get permission from the Chapin Foundation to quote them. And Sandy Chapin, Harry Chapin's widow, is reading the book now. And everybody knows the Chapin song, what's the one about the boy, the son, Cats in the Cradle? This is a much better song. It's about a daughter. It's about a man looking at his daughter growing up and going away from him. It's the most gut-wrenching song you'll ever hear. And I heard this song years ago, right before I started writing this book, and it never left me. I was almost going to bring a CD player down and play it, But I defy any father with a daughter to listen to that song and not cry. It's an amazing song, and it's one of the central themes of the book, because in the book, that song shows up for various characters, and by the end of the book, one of the fathers finds that song because his daughter mentioned it in a secret journal, this daughter, and she said her father was turning into a Harry Chapin song. It's an impulse I understood completely, and he has to go down to Discount Records in downtown Athens and ask the sort of frizzy-haired, crazy clerk down there to find the song for him, and that helps him break out, because he is so grief-stricken about the death of his daughter. He can't come to terms with it. So that's a long answer to a basic writing question, which is like, how do you develop any kind of empathy for characters? You have to use, imagine the worst in real life.
Larry Baker's with us. Athens America is his new book. Other questions or comments from the audience here at Prairie Lights Bookstore, let me know. And you're listening to Live from Prairie Lights. Much of this in the book is, some of it is about these fathers coming to terms with the grief that they've encountered. A lot of the book is also directed toward how this Joe Hawley is grappling with being a council member on this council and all the intrigue that goes on with that. And so that's where your real life experience comes into play.
It's difficult to convince people of this, to tell them that in a lot of ways Iowa City is not unique. So what's interesting to me is the response to people outside of Iowa City to reading this book. Because they will recognize aspects of their own town in it, I hope. The problem here is everybody's going to read this as journalism and not as fiction. Well, that's not my recollection of these events, so it's all wrong. I just encourage people to write their own books. I'm fair and I'm unfair. And the first draft of this, which was 550 pages long, was a nasty book. Well, it was just awful. And it's a lot of it's gone. I mean, a lot of it, 2/3 of it's gone. It's great therapy. Just work it out. So it is. It's what happens in towns when there's a crisis, and I had one perspective, and I wrote about it.
And I would ask that question, if you were an author from out of town, I didn't know you, but knew that you were in part of a council. I would ask that, Larry. I wanted to make you aware of that. You were listening to Live from Prairie Lights, and there's a question here.
Larry, recently I've been reading about a number of authors, Charles Dickens and James Joyce and Saul Bellow. They were all great novelists. And one of the things which is really interesting about all three of them is that they mind their lives. The creative part of them, what they really created was the total picture, but the individual facts were actually things which they had experienced, people that they knew, and words that people said, and characteristics that people had. And I'm kind of curious about how that works out with you. For instance, the expression that the one fellow has, that his knees turned to crap. Is crap the word, by the way?
No, Julie wouldn't let me say the word.
No, of course not. But my question is, did you invent that, or did you hear that?
My knees turned to shit.
Right.
I don't know. It seemed like something that the character would say.
Okay.
I don't know if you got away with it there, Larry.
Well, see, if I read the other scene about the big deer in the park, that's got a lot better language in it. But see, part of the problem with y'all as an audience and Iowa City as an audience is you will read this and you'll see humor where no other town will see humor. You will see satire where somebody else will see tragedy, who doesn't know anything at all about Iowa City. I think one of my favorite scenes in the whole book is where ABC News comes to town to cover this tragedy in the book. And the narrator is nervous about this because he's afraid they're going to get it all wrong. But at the very end, he watches the TV with the sound off, and he just watches the visual of the town, about where the reporter's in front of the Prairie Schooner bookstore. You have to put yourself out the front door. And he's on the building across the street with a camera looking down. And the reporter's talking, and the camera sort of pans back, and it takes in the whole downtown and then swings around to catch the college. And then swings around to catch the park on the north side and swings over to Oakland Cemetery and sort of focuses in. And he said if the camera had just gone a little bit further, you would have had this black angel. And it's sort of like it's his favorite part of the book, of the experience, was being able to visualize the whole town. It's very grounded in reality, concrete material detail. This is Iowa City, and it's not. So I have to keep telling you this over and over again. It's not. But this story would not have occurred, would not have happened, would not have been written if Iowa City didn't exist.
Larry Baker's with us. Athens, America is his new book, and there's a couple questions in the audience. There's a question here.
Larry, I've only read a portion of the book so far, but I'm wondering from your presentation as well, what brought you to write this?
That's an easy one. It's the same thing that brought me to write a book about the movie business, Flamingo Rising. It's the same thing that every day something happens to me and I tell myself, that'd be a good story. That's a good character. That's a good line. I mean, it becomes automatic after a while that you keep this mental Rolodex of events. And it is a good story. And this is just one aspect of this town. And as I keep repeating, the events that inspired the book need their own writer. They need a different writer than me. Because it can be a completely different story. The villains can be heroes. The heroes can be villains, depending on your point of view. I mean, one of the great things about this book, and one of the great things about writing this book, was I got to play with some symbols of Iowa City. You know, the Black Angel. I'm very proud of the cover of this book. I designed it. If you look closely, there's a deer in the background.
For listeners, it's a blood red, as you like to
Blood
use
red.
that phrase, book with the picture of the Black Angel.
Yeah, Howard Horan is here. Howard's over there. Howard is the graphic guy that put it together for me. I said, give me a picture of the Black Angel that hasn't been seen before, make it look different. We fudged out some names on tombstones and put in people that I don't like. You know?
I noticed the author's name is on one of the tombstones. Is that right?
You mean mine?
Yeah.
It's got to be on the front. I mean, I can't
Okay.
avoid that. I mean, talking about my ex-agent, people like that, you know.
I see.
I have a friend in New Orleans who wanted me to put her ex-husband on a tombstone. He's on there too, you know. She didn't like, but it's a little bitty pleasure. An interesting thing about the whole process is that how many of you all actually read the entire book? There's one or two people. All right. The first and last chapter, you got the first chapter not about the accident. The last chapter is coming, I'm not going to say a word. Those were written a year after I finished the book. Because I couldn't figure, there's something wrong here. I didn't have the right opening, I didn't have the right closing. And then listening to that Harry Chapin song and this whole idea of, death cuts off a relationship too quickly. There's no time to get used to it. And so this one father in particular is dealing with the death of his 15-year-old daughter, and the other father is still dealing with the death of his daughter 15 years ago. She would have been 15 at this moment in time. So what he does is he goes to the cemetery and talks to his daughter. Now, that's one thing. Of course, what he finds out later is that his wife has been talking to the daughter, and the daughter's been talking back to the wife. One of the differences between the two characters. And so the two fathers have to find a way to talk to their children. And I just want to give you a little hint. When you read the last chapter, go back and pick up your collection of Emily Dickinson poetry and go find a poem called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held with just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. It's the first and only poem I've ever memorized. I was like 12 years old because I was death obsessed. Oh my God, it's going to come. And it hit me that the way to finish this book is to do a prose version of that poem. So that, I think you ought to keep in mind when you get to that point. Also, by the end of the book, we're in Never Never Land by the end of the book. There are things going on that you hint at, and it's very different.
It's sort of your own style of magical realism, shall we
Absolutely.
put it that way. Have you experienced a close death in the way that these men have?
No. No.
Okay.
The only death I've experienced comparably in the book is there's a funeral scene here of the narrator and his older brother burying their father. And I wrote that scene 2 years before my own father died, and that's basically what his funeral looked like when it happened. I just visualized that ahead of time. And the trick was that my parents bought one plot. I had an older father, younger mother, and the mother died. My mother died before my father for like 20 years. And so the joke at the funeral is, oh, Daddy gets to be on top forever, and Mother's going to be so angry. I mean, I used that line at the real funeral 2 years after I wrote it. All right.
Larry Baker's with us. Athens, America is his new book, and there's a question here.
It seems like race plays an important part in this story. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's in the formation process of putting together a story. You know, you can, well, this happened, so let's just use all of this real material. But I don't want to use that material. That particular story that inspired the original story, that's not my story. That doesn't belong to me. That belongs to some other family. That's not my story. So if I make the decision, well, who are the victims here? And what are the issues? And one of the things that develops in the book is Athens is a perfect town. We all know this. It's a college town. Art, culture, money, everything. But Athens also is like a small version of the larger country, an affluent country with pockets of poverty, with pockets of racism. Well, I wouldn't say pockets, I would say blatant in many ways. So how does that bigger issue fit into this smaller town and relate it to this environment? So yeah, it's important that one of the kids be an outsider and another kid be sort of a mixture of cultures. Indeed, race plays a part by the end, and sort of like the campaign at the end for re-election of the narrator. Race is an issue. You could argue that race is an issue in Iowa City, but so far off the radar screen, nobody deals with it.
Athens, America is Larry Baker's new book. Other questions or comments from the audience here at Prairie Lights Bookstore? Joe Hawley in this book is unforgiving, shall I say, or it's degrading in his commentary, it seems, to some women, feminist women. And I'm wondering if you might address that.
Are you talking about the reference to the Women's Holistic Information Program, known as WHIP? I repent that remark. Julie, you've done this with other writers. You have to separate the writer and the characters.
I said Joe Hawley, who's a character in your book.
Joe Hawley is a very acerbic, ironic, politically incorrect. I mean, the first thing he thinks about when he goes into the classroom, and his wife, his future wife, is the teacher, and she says, they've done surveys of this course, and they've discovered that most people find their future spouse in an English class. So Holly, the first thing he looks around, he sees this peroxide blonde, looks like a stripper. He's just going crazy and then he turns around and he looks, he's just been had by this other woman up in front. So yeah, he's, as he says in the description of why he could never get elected to anything but a local race, is because they do background checks. The higher up you go, and all they'd have to do is talk to, people that knew him outside before he came to Athens. He's very politically incorrect. But there's also in the book a great deal of affection and warmth towards other women.
Larry Baker's with us. Athens, America is his latest book. And can I name who you are, since you're in the book?
Mr. Sanders. Gary Sanders is the assistant manager of the Hollywood Theater in downtown Athens. He comes out of the bathroom all the time, stomach problems, complaining to the boss, Bubba, the lefties are coming after you. Watch out, Bubba. All right, Gary, question?
You didn't get permission from anyone to use their names, real names in this book. Is that
Like I said,
accurate?
if your real name is in this book, it's because
Okay.
you are a good person.
All right. There's a question here.
And hopefully in this book I get a date, right?
That's the scene of the park.
Yes. Anyway, the whole
Once you
image,
graduate from high school, you're all set.
the whole image of the deer is very interesting. The blood red deer. How did you come to that in your writing process?
I was on the council when we discussed killing deer, and there was this intense part of but that was one of those discussions where I literally wanted to step back and say, this is getting crazy. I mean, I understand the issue and why you don't want to kill deer, but it became very weird to me after a while. So I was going to throw that in. That was comic relief in this book to begin with, and yet the more these deer started showing up, all of a sudden I needed one deer, and he was just a little bit bigger than usual. And by the time I finished writing the first chapter that he was in, he was huge. Now the problem is, only the narrator sees him. Everybody else sees a big deer. The narrator sees a 30-foot deer. He goes into the woods in Weber Park trying to rescue his son, and a 30-foot deer starts chasing him. The deer, by the way, is named Hartford. I love that. See, now that's where I'm going to get in trouble. But we'll see what that insurance company says. So it's a pretty obvious symbol once you read the whole book. And just keep in mind, when the deer starts talking, his lips don't move. So don't think of this Mr. Ed business, you know.
That was the scene that you were going to read if we'd had time.
Yes.
No, I wasn't going to say much more than that. And
No,
I won't,
I'm sorry.
and I would never give it away. In fact, the ending is, well, I don't even want to say much about it, but
It's the only part of the book where I cried. And I wrote it.
the structure of this book, Larry, would you say a few words about structuring it? As you did say, it alternates with the voices. You have actually
Yeah.
Jack Hamilton in italics in certain sections,
Yeah.
and then the time alternating with time as well.
Well, one of the things that was interesting to me, I originally planned to have the two fathers actually meet.
And I was going to ask, are they alter egos?
Yes, but I couldn't figure out a way to get them together. So I had the third-person version of one life, the first-person version of another life, both fathers who've lost their daughters, and the Jack Hamilton guy, I'm putting him in third person because, in a sense, he is not a participant in any other part of the book except his own crisis with him and his wife and the loss of their daughter. They don't deal with the public events. They don't deal with they don't get interviewed. They don't sue the city. They refuse to participate in anything. They just want to be left alone. And at the end, well, you have to read it. And so that, I do like a section of Jack Hamilton, and then you do the larger first-person narration. And by the middle of the book, the Hamilton family has got the news about their daughter, and then it's what happens after that to them. And so very often there are parallel scenes from the third-person point of view and then the first-person point of view of the same scene. And what you'll discover, it's a very different perception. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the book is the funeral of Becky Hamilton. It takes place in St. Mary's Church. And the description of that church in the book is exactly the description of St. Mary's. I wrote that sitting there in Mass every Sunday, picking out the little details I wanted in that particular scene. So by the end of the book, I thought, well, boy, they're going to meet. They're going to have the arms around each other. They're going to do, and it wouldn't work. I couldn't figure out a way as a writer to get them together. And so they just remain on their parallel lives. But at the end, there are three different endings. There is the Jack Hamilton ending. There is the Joe Holly ending, where they're both wrapping up their lives. And then there's the third, final ending, and that's, don't say.
Athens, America is Larry Baker's new book. Other questions or comments from the bookstore audience? This is live from Prairie Lights. Where do you go from here as far as writing another book, other than out the door? I know you're going to
gonna go to the Atlas and have a
Are you
drink.
going to? And that Atlas is in this as well. But-
I'm working on 2 possible books, but it's very early. And one is I wrote a book between Flamingo and this one about teaching and education, which in hindsight wasn't a very good book. And I think I know what I did wrong with it, so I may go back and cut 200 pages out of that and start from scratch again with some basic characters. But I've got another book about a dying editor who's, I know it's in all the stuff that I write. People are croaking right and left. And he's got a manuscript from another writer who he's going to rewrite because the other writer dies. And so what the editor is going to start doing is slowly morphing this manuscript that nobody else has even seen yet into his own story of this relationship he's had with a woman for 30 years. And it sounds good, but it's too early to tell right now.
Last question I'll ask then is, what do you hope people will understand or learn or feel about local politics and working with or being on a council and also in the larger frame of things as well. So what I'm asking is what you think, what you hope this audience will receive from this book in comparison or in addition to on a larger scale of people from outside this community.
I can't tell people what I hope they get out of it. I mean, tell you what I learned, not only in writing the book, but actually near the end of my last term, was that you're not always right all the time. That you can have all of the facts on your side. You can make, and that's what he does in this, what the narrator does in this book. He makes a case for a particular local issue. It's ironclad. He makes the case, and this is what the public ought to do. If they had any sense at all, it's up to a vote. They kick him out, and they vote on this particular issue just the opposite of what he advocated. And they're not wrong. But they brought into it. Now, America is wrong a week ago. But, well, that was easy.
That's the title of your book, Athens, The Democratic Side of Life. Athens, America is Larry Baker's new book and published by First Coast Books. Beth Donaldson engineered this edition. I'm Julie Englander, and thank you, Larry Baker, for being here on Life in Prairie Lights.